The first time it happened, I was walking home in the small hours of the night from a party in Cardiff through the back streets of Splot when suddenly the clouds were moving in a really interesting way. And then they morphed into the strangest procession of figures I'd ever seen. They streamed across the sky. I knew who they were. They were the Wild Hunt from Celtic mythology. Gwyn the Hunter striding ahead with his head with stag's antlers. The Lady Rhiannon. And a whole cavalcade of lords and ladies. And their dogs and horses and falcons. Some of them amazingly half human, half animal. A man with tusks like a boar and wild hair. A beautiful woman, but also a fox. And a whole host of others of all descriptions and shapes and sizes. They could see me. They beckoned me and ushered it if I should come and join them. I didn't know how to get up there in the sky with them, and I was amazed at what would happen if I did. So I just watched, and gradually they faded away and became the clouds, and then just the night sky. And I walked home through the lamplight of the Splot black streets with everything sparkling as if it had been touched by just a bit of fairy dust. But there was no sound. It was completely silent. Was it just me? Was anybody else going through this?
The faces were cartoony characters, zombie faces with no eyes in the socket, and they had blood coming down their cheeks.
And I've had things like my mum, probably in her 30s, sat by my bed, buffaloes running across the curtains, and I also see like a shadowed figure with a top hat.
What is this? Is this normal? Am I having a breakdown? I had no idea what was happening to me.
And I didn't want to tell anybody.
But I told everyone. They said everything from you must be having a paranormal experience to you must be going bonkers. I started to wonder if I was developing some sort of mental health condition. And then I was on tour with the Disabled People's Theatre Company, and a guy with visual impairment said, I know what that is. It's Charles Bonnet Syndrome. It affects people mostly who've lost their central vision. Your brain puts in what your eyes don't see, and they see visions. They see fantastic things. And that's what it turned out to be. But this was 30 years ago, and it's continued on and off ever since.
Charles Bonnet Syndrome is not necessarily linked to a specific visual disorder. It tends to be anything that affects at least central vision. I mean, it has actually been shown in some cases where central vision isn't affected, but there has to be some kind of visual impairment.
Dr. Matt Dunn is a senior lecturer at the School of Optometry and Vision Sciences at Cardiff University.
So it's actually split pretty much a third of each. A third of people find it to be positive, a third of people kind of find it to be neutral, but in a third of cases it is a negative thing. People wish they didn't have them. So that's why we're trying to work on understanding what the cause is so we can help those people that would prefer not to have them.
I think the purpose of this programme is to explain to people that sometimes when people say they see things that other people can't see, they really are seeing them, and they're not crazy, and they're not on drugs. They are just experiencing the world in a different fashion. I see things every day that other people don't, and I believe that I see them, but that doesn't make them real. So the purpose of this is to explain to people that Charles Bonnet Syndrome is real, and that many, many people experience it, and they shouldn't be scared, and they shouldn't think they're crazy.
Apologies, that's my guide dog. He's still got his bell on him. I'm just going to take it off because you don't want that in the background.
Sounds like if we were at Santa's grotto, doesn't it?
Hi, my name's Nina Chesworth. I'm the programme coordinator at Esme's Umbrella. I'm also blind and have Charles Bonnet Syndrome.
Esme's Umbrella is a charity that raises awareness of Charles Bonnet Syndrome, supporting medical research and offering what it calls a safe shelter for those living with CBS. And I should say that since starting to make this programme, they've asked me to be their ambassador here in Wales.
Hi, nice to kind of meet you.
Yeah. So when did your Charles Bonnet, your CBS visions start, and what form do they take?
I've been visually impaired since I was 2 years old. I've had varied levels of sight. Looking back now, as a child and a teenager, I'd see things like faces coming out of my duvet cover and flowers growing up the wall. I told my mum, and she was just, oh, it's just your imagination, there's nothing there. And because at the time I had usable sight as well, we just didn't think anything of it. I lost my right eye in an accident at work 17 years ago, and then lost the sight completely in a separate accident at home 7 years ago now. So ultimately, I've ended up blind through 2 different accidents and not the actual original eye condition I had. When I lost the sight completely, it was when I was in the hospital coming around from the surgery. They saved my left eye, but I don't have any usable sight in that anymore, but I still have the eye. And I came around from the surgery and I just remember seeing these colours. I was kind of like, they've saved something. And I'll remember these words till the day I die. The doctor said, I can assure you we haven't saved your sight, it's just your mind playing tricks on you. So, what do you do with that? When things started to quieten down, I really began to notice that these colours had actually started to develop more. Oranges, purples, greens, shapes. I remember being in quite a dark place at the time. I'd noticed that the hallucinations started to get more complex. They started to form faces and animals. The faces were cartoony characters, so they were like zombie faces with no eyes in the socket, and they had blood coming down their cheeks. There was snarling dogs. It looked like the dog out of Ghostbusters.
Sounds to me like, compared to my journey, it's quite a fast progression. Even though you, like as you said, you'd had a bit of it when you were a child and maybe discounted it or not linked it in. I too did at first didn't link it to my sight loss. But did you tell other people about it?
For those first 5 weeks, I hid it. I definitely didn't tell anybody. Well, I just couldn't keep it in anymore. I was just so frightened and worried and didn't know what was happening. I thought I need it. It just came out of me, and from that point on, we all kind of came together and started looking on the internet and trying to find answers. And it was then that I came across Judith Potts and Esme's Umbrella, and then that's when I began to get answers. We got invited down to one of her patient support days, and if I'm honest, even though I got the answers from the science and the medical side of things and understood why it was happening to me, it's your brain still functioning, it's still doing its job. There's just no messages going from the eye to the brain anymore, and it's now filling in the blanks. It was the speaking to other people who have CBS that really helped me kind of move forward. That's when I began to open up more about my experiences and talk about it a lot more.
Speaking to others who've got CBS, Charles Bonnet Syndrome, has been fantastic for me because this is still not a widely known phenomenon. So a lot of the people who've got it have never spoken to anybody about it. And for me to talk to other people has been a huge privilege, actually, and a relief to find out that many of the things I thought might just be happening to me actually happen to other people, and that other people experience it in a very different way from me. I didn't really know what was happening, whether it was because of my slightly rock and roll lifestyle, I was seeing stuff that I probably shouldn't really ought to, or whether it was something to do with the fact that I was losing my eyesight, which I didn't connect them, or in my worst times, I thought I might be developing some sort of mental health issue based around anxiety at losing my sight. It manifests itself every day in some of what I consider to be the minor hallucinations. I call one the maggotscape, particularly when I go from a darker place into a brighter light. I get lots of little little fuzzy, little squiggly worms, and they can either be white or they can be electric blue or electric purple. They spin around and dance in front of the real life picture, and then sometimes they coalesce into little blobs and spin around, and then eventually they shatter apart and form what I see almost all the time, which is what I call a starscape. And then I get geometric shapes which curve off into the sky, or the white lines on the road lifting up and curving off. That's like a constant thing. But then there's the more, what I call a full-blown vision.
So I've generally got a permanent vision if the best way to describe it's in the top right corner of my vision, and then it sort of drifts up, and as I look back down again, it comes back and resets.
This is Jerry Bradley, once an Air Force man at RAF Brawdy in Pembrokeshire, who now works with Blind Veterans UK and has helped with a number of research projects. And Jerry's the only person I've ever met who shares my eye condition, Stargardt's disease.
So sat here now, I've got a vision on the wall behind me. If you remember the cartoon Bagpuss, imagine something like that, but it's a black and white line drawing, bit abstract, and that's permanently there. I have other occasions where I wake up, or it wakes me up, I'm not quite sure. And I've had things like my mum, probably in her 30s and perfect clear, sat by my bed. I've had buffaloes running across the curtains. But that was when my wife was watching Yellowstone, the Kevin Costner series. And I've had like a bright flashing light disco events. And I also see like a shadowed figure with a top hat.
How did you feel the first time you experienced this? What did you think was going on?
I had absolutely no idea, and I didn't want to tell anybody. In fairness, I tried to hide my sight loss as much as I could as well, which on reflection probably wasn't the best thing to do. But so it wasn't long after that I got this, and I was thinking, oh my God, is my brain going as well now? Am I falling to bits? I was only in my 50s then, and I was like, oh no, what's going on? And I went to my local charity in Bucks Vision at the time, and they were doing a thing on Charles Bonnet. I went, I've got that. Once I knew what it was, I've been happy talking about it. And now I've turned it into a bit of a game with people, if you like, because when I'm out and about, I'll say to somebody and point to them on the wall and say, my hallucination on that back wall. And the natural reaction is to turn around and look. So when they turn around and look, I just go, you can't see my hallucinations, they're just mine. And they go, oh God, you tricked me on that one. Or it sort of breaks the ice a bit, and then it makes it easier to talk about it.
So what is Charles Bonnet Syndrome? Here's a brief NHS description. A condition that means that you see things which aren't there. Hallucinations. It's not a mental health condition or caused by dementia. It's usually related to sight loss. For example, age-related macular degeneration or cataracts. It's visual. You don't smell, hear or feel things. It was named after a Swiss naturalist and philosopher, Charles Bonnet. Charles spotted the condition in his aging grandfather. That was back in the 18th century. Here in the 21st century, doctors are still investigating. Here's Dr. Matt Dunn again.
Yeah, it's quite common for people not to know what the cause is, and also a lot of people who start to experience these visions often don't volunteer it to a medical professional because they worry about their mental health and they think that's what it is.
Well, I mean, the thing is, at the time, I was running scared of telling anybody.
Charles Bonnet Syndrome is not necessarily linked to a specific visual disorder. It tends to be anything that affects at least central vision. I mean, it has actually been shown in some cases where central vision isn't affected, but there has to be some kind of visual impairment.
I used to walk my dog every day in the woods over from my house. And in front of one particular tree, I would see a sort of woman wearing looked like the woman from Scottish Widows advert, to be honest. And she'd be standing in front of this tree. So within the first time of seeing this, I knew it was a hallucination. But what I found weird about CBS is that even though I know this, so therefore my brain should stop filling in the wrong thing, I always saw that woman who would then morph into the tree. And if I go there now, I can more or less guarantee that I would still see that woman.
It's interesting you should say that, because actually one of the hypotheses we've been looking into is whether the hallucinations come about because of what we call top-down processing, which is that expectation, right? Your knowledge that's not a woman, it's a tree, should be enough to say, okay, the second time
Absolutely,
I see that, the hallucination isn't there, and that's one of the things we found not to be the case, at least in the way we were looking at it. So that's why we're still searching around for answers. Obviously, we talk a bit about the actual content, because you've described both the what we call simple and complex hallucinations. You're saying that the simple ones, which is things like patterns and lights and so on, are there most of the time for you.
Yeah.
But the complex ones, which is people, faces, and visual scenes, do you see whole visual scenes or just individual?
The most vivid one I had was 2 years ago. I was doing an arts project, and we were living in Dylan Thomas's house in Swansea, the house where he was born, working on a script which was based on that with some young actors. Now, I was sat in Mrs. Thomas's pristine parlour at the front of Cumdonkin Drive, and we'd had a break, so the actors had gone off to make a cup of tea or whatever, and I was on my own in the room. And Ellie, who was our movement director, who I hadn't worked with before, so a young woman, walked into the room. And I said, hiya. Didn't react to me, which was unusual, because she's very friendly, and went and sat on a chair in the corner and just sat very quietly. And I looked at her, and then about a minute later, thinking, I hope she's all right. Should I say anything? But maybe she just wants to be quiet. And then I thought, oh my goodness, that's not Ellie, right? And of course what happens is, and this is the only time this has ever happened, is the door opened and Ellie walked into the room.
What happened to the original Ellie? Or the other Ellie?
So the real Ellie.
What happened to the hallucinated
Well,
Ellie?
this is it. So I immediately look at the hallucinate, because I expected it to vanish. Didn't go. And Ellie's going, are you all right? And I say, well, not exactly, but they know about CBS because it's formed part of this script I'm working on, all the rest of it. And I go, I'm having the weirdest experience I've ever had. You're sat in the corner. She went, what happens if I go and sit in the corner? And I went, I have no idea. She went, shall I try it? And I'm like, okay. You know, just like in a film where you see, but in reverse, where you see the spirit leaving the body. It was like the body entering the spirit. She sat, and then I realised, I thought this before, the figures I see as hallucination are slightly smaller than real life. So Ellie sat inside Ellie, didn't match. And I can still see both of them. And as you can imagine, I'm going, oh, this is weird. This is, you know, and then I said, oh, please get up. And she got up and I went, oh, that's weirder. And so we carried on. And it took about 10 minutes. But the hallucinogenic Ellie gradually faded out. And that I've not before, not since.
I wanted to ask though about the relevance, because some people will say that the Charles Bonnet Syndrome hallucinations have no relevance to them whatsoever. And you say in your case you feel that they always do, or...
I've only recently considered this. I thought they just were what they were, and it was my brain filling in what I wasn't seeing with something I might like to see. I've sometimes been startled by my visions, but I've never been scared by them. I mean, the sort of green man faces I see in trees and hedges and coming out of old stone walls, they were disturbing when I saw them for the first time stone cold sober after seeing The Wild Hunt. And they always acknowledge me. They always wink or stick their tongues out or beckon or something. Right. They can always see me.
So for you, is it relative? Would you say it's a neutral experience? It's not positive or negative on the whole? It's a neutral?
I would say in the main, I like them. It's positive.
Okay.
I'm an actor and writer, and I'm currently working on a new project with Claire Tanner from Llanrug in Eryri. Claire's very definitely interested in the visual side of things.
You might get sort of the effects that Chris gets with the Charles Bonnet Syndrome is, you know, like the little squiggly lines that appear, or like the stars might, you know, start flickering in and out, or, you know, showing the Wild Hunt.
Claire is a creative director who is going to be turning my play about Dylan Thomas's blind Captain Cat and his life before Under Milkwood into a virtual reality experience. And hopefully we're going to give people just a hint of what Charles Bonnet Syndrome is all about.
I didn't know anything about Charles Bonnet. Stepfather's, you know, partially sighted and things like that, so I understand that. But hallucinations from it, filling in the blanks and things like that, I've learnt all this on this journey with Chris. Some of the things we've been talking about is like some of the effects that, like how to replicate those hallucinations and things with technology, like when Chris walks into a dark space after having been in light, or coming out of the dark space into the light. How can we achieve that to really give everybody a kind of a realistic sense of what it's like to have Charles Bonnet Syndrome?
In general, I'm against trying to make a non-disabled person experience what it's like to have a disability. You know, I'm not in favour of, if you've sat down in a wheelchair and pushed yourself around for half an hour, you know what it's like, or if you've put a blindfold on, you know what it's like. I think you've just found out what it's like to sit in a wheelchair for half an hour or to be blindfolded. But I think with VR, the effect we can give the participant will be far more authentic to understand what it might be like for someone with but with my visual impairment, which matches the characters. Instead of the big point of the thing, will be an added intensity within what is a cinematic, dramatic story narrative. One of the things that's been fantastic about going on the journey and making this program is that it's put me in much closer contact with other people like me and other people who don't have sight loss, who are striving to publicise it, to help, and, in the case of science, to find out what is going on, why is it going on, and what does it mean for the rest of us in terms of how we understand how the brain works. And I think, especially when I think about the way it relates to possibly people who've seen paranormal stuff, or possibly people who experience other sorts of hallucinations, whether that's through any sort of brain activity, or whether that's illness, or just experiencing things when they're in a darkened environment for too long. The more we can learn about the brain, the better we'll understand ourselves, and the better we understand ourselves, the better it is for everybody.
So we still don't know exactly what the cause is, but one idea is, you know, as Oliver Sacks set out, that it's to do with the part of the brain that specifically perceives objects. So there's a part of the brain called the inferior temporal cortex, and that specifically encodes for objects or various classes of objects. And as you said, you know, it could be something like faces and buildings and so on. There is actually a very specific dedicated part of the brain for faces, which is why it's so common for us to see faces looking at clouds and so on. You know, that's something that everyone experiences to a certain degree. And you said earlier that you saw the people that you see in hallucinations tend to be smaller, and that's pretty common across the board. It's known as Lilliputian hallucinations, and they can vary from being very, very tiny to but somewhat. In your case, it sounded like they were slightly smaller, but
yeah,
not.
I think that fits in. So what's your research focusing on? What are you trying to get at?
So the most recently we've been looking at trying to understand why some people with vision loss have these hallucinations and some people don't, right? Because many people will have a similar level of vision loss to you and never hallucinate. And we really don't know why. What we're looking at the moment is whether that has to do with the vividness of people's visual imagination, because actually in the last sort of decade or so, we've learnt that there are some people without visual impairment who have really a really kind of acute way to imagine visual objects. So if I said to you, imagine an apple, some people can very clearly see an apple. Some people will see it very real as if it's in the room. We call that hyperphantasia. Some people can't see anything at all. They can't imagine an image in their head, and that's called aphantasia. And so it was sometime in the last decade or two that was discovered, and researchers recently found that this is on a kind of spectrum. So what we're looking at is whether the people that are more have a more vivid visual imagination are more likely to then go on to develop hallucinations. And this is really our first attempt to try to understand what is leading to some people having the hallucinations and some people not.
At one point, when I first started having visions, I considered that what was happening to me might be verging or paranormal or occult. I no longer think it was, but it does strike me that when other people see things that they believe are ghosts or inexplicable visions, that they may be experiencing CBS or something that is happening in the brain which is like CBS.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because that is one of the questions and one of the things that I do say to people. I kind of half-heartedly laugh it off, but I think part of me does believe it, that I wonder if this is where ghost stories came from. If you think about all them hundreds of years ago, people still had sight loss. People were still experiencing Charles Bonnet, but they had no awareness of it whatsoever. So most people were put in asylums, locked away. So I do definitely question that. I do. Is this where ghost stories originated from?
What you've just said goes back to my previous comment where I said I see a shadow in a top hat at the end of my room. That's almost like a ghost. It's more like a shadow than a ghost, but
Yeah.
when you get these horror films and there's a shadow of a character there, it's just a black and white shadow at the end of your room, and there's a little bit of light there, and he's there.
Charles Bonnet himself said that the syndrome is the theatre of the mind generated by the machinery of the brain.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Your brain just decides, well, you're having trouble seeing things. I'll just give you something to see to keep you happy, almost.
I mean, I can relate to this.
Yeah.
We are telling very similar stories in a very similar way. Well, I'm very used to them happening to me now. I've been living with them for 30 years, and I've grown rather to like them. The light effects can be stunning. Seeing something truly different that isn't there can be interesting. It can also be comforting. I've come to live with these strange green men and stone trolls peering at me out of walls. I rather have come to think of them as the spirit of the woods or the spirit of the wall. I know they're not real and they're not really there, but I just kind of think of them as, I don't know, the fair folk, the old ways, having a little look at me and keeping in touch. If I was to lose that now, I wouldn't like it. But I know that there are other people out there who don't have such a good relationship with CBS, who find it very scary or very isolating or very difficult to cope with. And I think that if I was one of those people, I would definitely not want to have the hallucinations anymore. And for some people, they're just neither good nor bad. They're just there, and they probably wish they weren't. They're probably a daily nuisance, because in order to get the visions to go away, you often have to move or shake your head or realign what you're thinking about. And that can be, like a lot of other things about living with sight loss, a daily faff and a real frustration. So I'm not pretending that everything about living with sight loss or having CBS is an absolute doddle and a holiday and wonderful. But you live your life in the world you live in, and I think you try and appreciate and try and treasure the good things about what you've got. And I do think if I didn't have CBS now, if they all stopped tomorrow, I would feel like I'd lost something slightly magical about the way I live my life. My thanks to Nina Chesworth of Esme's Umbrella, Jerry Bradley of Blind Veterans UK, and Dr. Matt Dunn of Cardiff University. If you want to find out more about Dr. Dunn's project or volunteer to take part, then look for the sight impairment study on the Cardiff University website. I'm Chris Talley-Evans. Can I Believe My Eyes? With a Steve Groves production for BBC Radio Wales. And remember what Bonnet said. The syndrome is the theatre of the mind generated by the machinery of the brain. I like that.